cheating wife left me broken, but I built my own life while she begged for forgiveness at the cafe. Alright, I guess I'll just dive right in. My name's Ryan, and my wife, Emily, and I had been married for 7 years. Everything seemed fine, normal, even. We had our little fights about household chores and whose turn it was to pick a movie, but overall, I thought we were solid. We were that couple people thought would last forever. Well, guess I thought wrong. The first sign something was off came in small changes. Emily suddenly started taking her phone everywhere. I mean everywhere, to the bathroom, outside to take calls, even in bed when she never used to. And then, there were her new late nights out with her friends from work. She always had excuses, team bonding, or sometimes she just needed to blow off steam after a stressful week. I didn't think too much of it at first. I trusted her. I mean, why wouldn't I? But as the late nights became more frequent, a little voice in the back of my head started asking questions I didn't want to hear. It was just another Friday night, and I was lying on the couch watching some mindless TV, half waiting for Emily to come home. She'd gone out with her work friends again, and it was already past midnight. She'd told me she'd be back by 10. But I'd learned not to expect her to stick to any time she gave me. 1 a.m. rolls around, and I hear the front door creak open. Emily stumbles in, reeking of cheap wine and perfume that wasn't hers. Her hair was a mess, and she was trying not to make too much noise, probably thinking I'd already gone to bed. But I was still up. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice calm, though I could feel my irritation bubbling just below the surface. She froze, clearly startled, and then shot me a quick, awkward smile like nothing was wrong. "Oh, hey. I didn't think you'd still be awake." "Yeah, well, you said you'd be back a few hours ago." "Yeah, sorry. You know how it is. We got carried away, and I lost track of time. You know how crazy those work nights can get." I didn't press her. Not yet. But something was definitely off. As she fumbled with her purse, probably trying to sober up, her phone buzzed. I glanced over, not even trying to be subtle about it this time. The screen lit up, and there it was, a text from some guy named Mark. I didn't know a Mark. We didn't have any friends named Mark. I couldn't see the full message, but it didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Something wasn't right, and this Mark guy was a piece of that puzzle. I didn't mention the text that night. A part of me wanted to confront her right away, but the other part of me needed more than just a gut feeling. One random message from a guy named Mark wasn't enough to blow up our whole marriage over, not yet. I wanted to believe it could still be something innocent, though deep down, I was already starting to doubt it. Over the next few days, my suspicion only grew. Emily didn't change her behavior, in fact, it became even more noticeable. She kept going out, always with the same old excuses, late-night work meetings, drinks with friends, you name it. When she was home, it was like she was physically present but mentally somewhere else. She'd spend hours on her phone, typing away or scrolling, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. Every time it buzzed, she would glance at the screen, smile, and then quickly tuck it away like she didn't want me to see. When I asked who she was talking to, the answers were vague, always the same. "Oh, just work friends," or "It's nothing, just some office gossip." But the way she brushed me off felt forced, like she was purposely trying not to give too many details. That's when I really started paying attention to the smaller things. I noticed she'd suddenly started putting in more effort with her appearance. Emily had always taken care of herself, but now it was like she had this newfound energy for looking her best, even when she was supposedly just running errands or grabbing coffee with coworkers. She'd put on her best outfits, the kind she used to save for date nights with me, along with perfume I hadn't smelled in months. I told myself maybe she just wanted to feel good about herself, that maybe I was reading too much into it, but the nagging feeling in my gut kept telling me otherwise. Then there were the late nights that seemed to come out of nowhere. I tried to be understanding, I knew her job could be demanding sometimes. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. She'd leave early in the evening, telling me she'd be back by 10 or so, only to stroll in after midnight, usually with a vague excuse about losing track of time or how the group had decided to hit another bar. And every time she walked through the door, that same look of awkwardness flashed across her face like she knew I was starting to question things but was hoping I wouldn't. It was subtle, but all these little changes began to stack up. The longer it went on, the harder it became to believe her stories. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was looking for problems where there weren't any. But once you notice something's wrong, it's like a switch flips, and everything they do feels like another piece of the puzzle. I didn't have any hard proof yet, but I couldn't deny the gut feeling anymore. Emily was hiding something, and I was going to find out what it was. After a few more days of suspicion, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't just sit around and let this eat away at me anymore. I needed to know the truth. There were too many coincidences and strange behaviors that just didn't add up. So, I made a plan. I'd follow her, not in some dramatic way, but just to see if she was really going where she said she was. One Thursday evening, Emily told me she was heading out with some friends from work for a team dinner. The moment the words left her mouth, I knew this was my chance. I played it cool, acting like I was totally fine with her plans, even offering to order some takeout for myself and stay in. She left around 7 p.m., and I gave her about 20 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out after her. I stayed a few cars behind her, careful not to get too close. I've never done anything like this before, and I felt weird, like I was being some kind of undercover investigator in my own life. But I had to know. My heart was pounding the whole time, wondering what I'd find or if I was just being paranoid. Emily's car made a turn off the main road, and instead of heading downtown toward the restaurants and bars, she took a sharp left into a residential neighborhood. This definitely wasn't where her coworkers lived. I slowed down and parked a little ways back, far enough to keep out of sight. She pulled into a driveway, and that's when I saw him. Mark. The guy from the texts. He was standing there in front of his house, leaning casually against his car like he'd been waiting for her. She got out of the car, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in a long time, and walked straight toward him. They hugged, and it wasn't the kind of hug you give a coworker. It was longer, more intimate, and when they pulled apart, he kissed her, right there in the open like it was the most normal thing in the world. I felt like the ground had fallen out from under me. For a second, I couldn't move. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The woman I'd been married to for 7 years, the one I trusted completely, was standing there kissing another man, like it was something she'd done 100 times before. My heart was racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I watched as they went inside, the door closing behind them. Part of me wanted to storm in there, confront them right then and there, but I knew I couldn't. I needed to think, to figure out what to do next. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real. My wife was cheating, and now I had the proof. Sitting in my car, staring at the door that had just closed behind Emily and Mark, I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. It was like I had stepped into someone else's life, like this couldn't possibly be happening to me. For a few minutes, I just sat there, trying to process what I had just seen. My mind was racing, but at the same time, I felt completely frozen. There had been moments before this, hints that something was wrong. I had convinced myself that I was just being paranoid, that maybe I was overthinking things. But seeing them together, out in the open, it became impossible to deny what was going on. All those late nights, the secretive behavior, it all clicked into place. The worst part wasn't even the kiss. It was how natural it looked. Like they'd done it before, like this wasn't some one-time mistake but something that had been going on for a while. Emily wasn't just casually seeing someone on the side, she was having a full-on affair, right under my nose. I sat there in my car, feeling a mix of emotions that I couldn't even begin to sort through. Anger, betrayal, sadness, confusion, it all hit me at once. My hands were shaking, and I had to take a few deep breaths just to calm down enough to think straight. What was I supposed to do now? Confront her? Pretend I didn't see anything? My head was spinning with questions, but there were no easy answers. Eventually, I knew I couldn't just sit there all night. I started the car and drove back home, my mind still replaying the moment over and over. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, mentally and emotionally. I sat on the couch in the dark, staring at nothing, trying to wrap my head around the fact that my marriage, the life I thought I had, was falling apart. A part of me wanted to confront her the second she walked back through the door, to demand an explanation. But another part of me wasn't ready for that yet. I didn't want to hear her excuses, didn't want to hear the lies I knew would come. Not yet. Instead, I decided to wait. I needed time to think, time to figure out what I was going to do. But one thing was for sure, everything had changed now. There was no going back. That night felt like the longest of my life. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, Emily laughing, smiling, kissing him. My mind was stuck in a loop, replaying that moment in front of his house over and over again. I wanted to shut it off, but I couldn't. I kept looking at the clock, waiting for her to come home, wondering what I'd say or do when she walked through the door. Part of me wanted to confront her, to call her out the moment she stepped inside. But another part of me was scared, scared of what she'd say, scared of the lies I knew she'd spin, and scared of how much worse this could get. Around 2 a.m., I finally heard the front door open. I stayed in the living room, the TV on but muted, as Emily walked in. She looked tired, or maybe that was just the guilt finally catching up with her. She gave me a quick smile, forced, like she was trying too hard to seem normal, and mumbled something about being exhausted from a long night with her friends. I didn't say much back, just nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. She barely glanced at me before heading straight to bed. I sat there in the dark for a while after she went upstairs, feeling numb. I had wanted her to slip up, to say something that would give me an excuse to confront her, but she didn't. She played it cool, like nothing was wrong. That almost made it worse. She was lying to my face, and I was letting her. The next morning, I woke up with a clear head, but the pain was still there, just beneath the surface. I had to make a decision. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, not when I knew what was really going on. But I also didn't want to blow up without a plan. I needed to figure out my next move. I spent the day thinking about what to do. Divorce? That word felt heavy, final, and I wasn't sure I was ready to go there yet. But staying together, pretending like this didn't happen? That wasn't an option either. I knew I couldn't live with that kind of betrayal hanging over us. I thought about confronting her, seeing if she'd admit to what she was doing, but I wasn't sure if I could handle her lies or deflections. By the end of the day, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this drag on any longer. I needed to confront her, to make her tell me the truth. Whatever happened after that, I'd deal with. But I had to face it head on. I couldn't live in the dark anymore. That night, when she came home again, I was ready. I wasn't going to let her off the hook this time. I was done playing the fool. That evening, I was on the couch, waiting for her to come home. My heart was racing, but I knew what I had to do. The pretending had to stop, and I wasn't going to let her just brush this under the rug again. I needed the truth, and I wasn't backing down. It was just past 10 p.m. when Emily walked in. She looked tired, like the weight of everything was catching up to her, though she tried to act like nothing was wrong. She gave me a quick, uneasy smile, but I wasn't playing along anymore. I called her to sit with me, and there was a moment of hesitation on her face, like she knew this was different. She couldn't avoid it now. I told her I knew. I said I had seen her with Mark. There was no avoiding it now. Her face went pale, the usual defenses dropping in an instant. She didn't try to deny it, but the look in her eyes said everything. She was caught. The excuses started. She claimed they were just friends, that I had misunderstood. But I wasn't buying it. Not after everything I had seen. I told her I had followed her. I had seen them together. The lies couldn't protect her anymore. She started to crumble, her voice trembling as she tried to explain, calling it a mistake. Hearing her say that, after everything she had done, felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. For months, she had made that choice again and again. When I asked how long it had been going on, she finally admitted it, months. She had been lying to me for months, carrying on behind my back, all while pretending everything was fine. I could feel the hurt settling deeper into my chest. This wasn't some one-time thing. This was deliberate. I asked her why she hadn't just told me, why she had kept lying to my face. She said she didn't want to hurt me, that she didn't want to lose me. But that just made it worse. She had already lost me the moment she chose to betray me. As I stood up, I knew there was no coming back from this. I told her it was over. I couldn't stay in a marriage that was built on lies, and the trust we once had was gone. She didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. I walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there in her guilt, tears falling silently. Our life together, the one I thought we had, was broken beyond repair, and all I felt now was emptiness. After that conversation, the silence between us was heavier than ever. Emily stayed in the living room for a while, probably trying to process everything, but eventually, she went upstairs without another word. I didn't follow her. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say, and the last thing I wanted was to be around her. I sat alone in the quiet, the weight of the whole situation crashing down on me. It was over. The life I had thought we were building, the future I had envisioned, it was all gone now. It was strange, sitting there in the same house that had once felt like home but now felt like a stranger's place, filled with memories that had lost their meaning. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of finality. I knew I couldn't stay in that house, not with her. The thought of being in the same space, pretending things were normal, was unbearable. So, I packed a bag. I didn't bother with the details of splitting everything up yet, that would come later. Right now, I just needed to get away, to clear my head. I sent her a message, letting her know I was leaving for a while, staying with a friend. I didn't wait for a response. As I drove, I wasn't sure where I was going at first. Eventually, I found myself pulling into the driveway of my best friend, Kevin. He had been my rock through other hard times, and even though I hadn't told him what was happening yet, I knew he'd understand. When he opened the door, there wasn't any need for explanation. The look on his face said it all. He could see that something had gone very wrong. Kevin let me in without asking questions. We sat in his living room, the TV on but neither of us really paying attention to it. He didn't push me to talk, which I appreciated. I wasn't ready to go through all the details again, not yet. The silence was comfortable, and for the first time in days, I felt a little bit of peace. Eventually, Kevin asked if I was okay, though both of us knew the answer. I wasn't. Not even close. But I nodded anyway, because what else could I say? I told him the basics, about Emily, about Mark, and about how I had seen everything. Kevin didn't offer empty reassurances or tell me it would all be fine. He just listened, understanding how deep the wound was. His quiet sympathy was what I needed more than anything else in that moment. The rest of the day passed slowly, and I knew I had to start thinking about the next steps. Staying with Kevin was a temporary fix. Sooner or later, I would have to go back, face the mess that my life had become, and figure out what came next. It was overwhelming, but for now, I was just trying to take it one day at a time. As I sat there, I realized that the path ahead was going to be long and painful, filled with tough decisions. But the one thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't go back to the way things were. Everything had changed, and from this point forward, I had to start rebuilding my life, piece by broken piece. Over the next few days, I stayed at Kevin's place, trying to find some sense of normalcy in a life that had been completely turned upside down. The silence helped, and having a friend close by made it easier to cope, but deep down, I knew that running away from the situation wasn't a solution. Sooner or later, I'd have to face it all, Emily, the house, and the future that now looked nothing like what I had imagined. Each morning, I woke up with that same heavy feeling in my chest, the reminder of everything I had lost. The house we shared, once filled with plans and dreams, now felt like a hollow shell, tainted by betrayal. I couldn't stay with Kevin forever, as much as I appreciated the escape. At some point, I'd need to go back and deal with the fallout. After a few days of letting things settle, I finally decided it was time. I couldn't avoid the inevitable. I messaged Emily, letting her know I was coming by to pick up some more of my things. Her response was brief, and that was fine with me. There was no need for long conversations now. When I pulled up to the house, it felt strange, like I was visiting a place that used to be mine but wasn't anymore. Everything about it felt distant, like a snapshot from a different time. As I walked through the door, Emily was in the kitchen, moving around like it was just another day. We didn't exchange much more than a few awkward glances. The tension in the air was thick, but neither of us seemed eager to start another conversation. We both knew how things stood. I went upstairs to the bedroom we had shared, the one that now felt more like a stranger's space. I grabbed what I needed, some clothes, a few personal items, but I couldn't help feeling the weight of each item I packed. Everything seemed to carry memories, small pieces of the life we once had. It was like a slow-motion reminder of what was slipping away. As I was getting ready to leave, Emily came to the door, looking like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. The silence between us stretched on for a moment, but I didn't press her. I didn't want more explanations or half-hearted apologies. I just wanted to get out of there. She eventually mumbled something about how sorry she was, how she didn't mean for things to end up this way. But by then, it didn't matter. The words felt hollow, too little, too late. I nodded, letting her speak, but I didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say. As I walked out the door, the finality of it all hit me again. This wasn't just a break or a rough patch. This was the end. Our life together, the one we had spent years building, was now a closed chapter. It was hard to accept, but I knew there was no going back. I drove away from the house, the weight of everything settling in deeper. I was officially starting over, and it felt like stepping into an unknown world, one where everything was uncertain. But for the first time in days, there was a small part of me that felt a bit lighter, like the decision to move forward, no matter how painful, was the right one. The road ahead wasn't clear, but I knew I couldn't stay trapped in the past. It was time to start figuring out what came next. The drive away from the house felt like a long, quiet moment of finality. As much as I had tried to mentally prepare for it, leaving the place that had once been home, now filled with nothing but memories and betrayal, hit harder than I thought it would. Each mile I put between me and that house seemed to symbolize the distance I was trying to create between me and the life I had lost. Over the next few days, I settled back into Kevin's place, knowing it was still a temporary solution. I wasn't ready to look for my own place just yet, but I also knew I couldn't keep staying with him forever. There was this strange in-between feeling I couldn't shake, caught between what my life used to be and what it needed to become. It was like trying to figure out a new version of myself while the old version was still grieving. Kevin, in his usual way, didn't push. He was there when I needed to vent, but he also gave me space when it was clear I wasn't ready to talk. It was comforting having someone who didn't expect anything from me, who wasn't trying to fix the situation but just letting me exist in it, however messy it was. One evening, as we sat watching some mindless TV, Kevin casually brought up the topic of what I was planning next. He didn't say much, just hinted that maybe it was time to start thinking about where I wanted to live, what I wanted to do with the next chapter of my life. It wasn't meant to be a heavy conversation, but the truth was, I hadn't really thought about it yet. My mind had been so wrapped up in the past, in what had happened with Emily, that I hadn't allowed myself to think too far ahead. That night, lying in bed, I started to consider what my next steps would be. I wasn't sure where to begin, but I knew I couldn't drift aimlessly forever. Moving on, as much as the thought scared me, was the only option now. I couldn't stay frozen in the wreckage of what had happened. The next morning, I decided to start small. I went online and began looking for apartments, nothing too serious at first, just browsing to see what was out there. The idea of living alone for the first time in years felt strange, but there was also a sense of possibility in it. It wasn't about rushing into a new chapter but about taking the first step toward it. Later that week, I called a lawyer. It wasn't something I was looking forward to, but the practical side of ending the marriage had to be dealt with. Divorce wasn't a word I ever thought I'd associate with myself, but it was the reality now. The conversation with the lawyer was straightforward. He explained the process, what I needed to do, and how things would likely play out. Hearing it laid out so plainly made it feel more real, but also gave me a sense of control, something I hadn't felt in weeks. Emily and I still hadn't discussed the details, but I knew that conversation was coming. The thought of it didn't fill me with anger anymore, just a kind of resigned sadness. The relationship was over, and while there was a time when I couldn't imagine my life without her, I was slowly coming to terms with the fact that I had no choice but to do just that. In the weeks that followed, I started taking more steps toward rebuilding. I wasn't rushing, everything still felt raw, and I didn't want to force the process. But I could feel a shift happening. The pain was still there, of course, but it wasn't as all-consuming as it had been. I found myself thinking more about what I wanted for the future, instead of constantly dwelling on what had gone wrong in the past. The road ahead was long, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, I wasn't focused on the past or the hurt. I was looking forward, slowly but surely, trying to figure out what my life could look like now that everything had changed. And while that thought was still overwhelming, it didn't feel as impossible as it once had. As the days passed, I knew that I couldn't avoid talking to Emily about the next steps any longer. The silence between us couldn't stretch forever, and as much as I dreaded it, we had to address the reality of divorce. It wasn't just about our relationship anymore, it was about the practical things, like splitting our assets and figuring out how to move forward legally. I couldn't keep avoiding it. One morning, I decided to message her. I kept it short and direct, suggesting we meet to discuss the logistics. There was no need for anything emotional or drawn out. We were past that. Her response came quickly, agreeing to meet and saying she was ready to talk. The message was polite but distant, as if both of us had silently agreed that keeping it civil was the only way to handle this now. A few days later, we met at a small cafe, neutral ground. It was the first time we'd seen each other since I left the house, and the awkwardness between us was palpable. Neither of us really knew how to start, so we danced around the real topic for a bit, talking about work and other small things that felt so out of place considering what was really going on. Eventually, the conversation shifted, and we began discussing the practical details, who would keep what, how we would divide things up. It was strange, almost mechanical, going through the list of shared possessions and deciding who would take what. The couch, the dishes, the car, it all seemed so trivial now, but it had to be done. Emily mentioned the house. She said she would probably move out soon, that staying there felt too heavy, too full of reminders. I understood that. It wasn't a place either of us could stay in without feeling the weight of everything that had happened. She suggested selling it, and I agreed. There was no point in holding on to it. It was part of our old life, and neither of us needed that reminder. As we talked, I noticed that neither of us got emotional. There were no tears, no outbursts of anger. Maybe we had both already come to terms with the fact that this was the end. It was just business now, a matter of tying up loose ends. And while that might have seemed cold, it was probably the only way we could get through it without falling apart all over again. At one point, Emily looked down and said she was sorry, for everything. It wasn't a dramatic moment, just a quiet acknowledgement of the hurt she had caused. I didn't respond right away, not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what to say. I had already heard her apologies, and they didn't change anything. Eventually, I just nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was the closest thing to closure I could offer. We wrapped up the conversation without much more to say. The logistics were settled, and we both knew the rest would be handled by our lawyers. As I left the cafe, there was a strange sense of finality to it. We had closed the book on our marriage, and now it was just a matter of time before everything was legally done. The drive back to Kevin's felt different. Lighter, in a way. Not because the situation was easy, it wasn't. But because the hardest part was over. I had faced Emily, had the conversation I had been dreading, and we had both walked away without dragging the past back into the present. In the days that followed, I felt the shift more clearly. With the legal process underway and the conversation with Emily behind me, I started to feel a new sense of control. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just reacting to the hurt, I was taking steps forward, one day at a time. The future still felt uncertain, but it no longer felt overwhelming. The worst was behind me, and now, slowly, I was learning how to move forward. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was mine to figure out. And that thought, though still a little daunting, didn't scare me as much as it used to. In the weeks following that final conversation with Emily, things started to shift in a way I hadn't expected. There was still plenty of sadness and confusion, but after sorting through the practical details of our divorce, it felt like I had let go of some of the weight I had been carrying. It was as though finally putting our past to rest, at least in legal terms, allowed me to begin thinking about the future without the constant pull of what had happened. Emily and I kept our communication strictly limited to what was necessary, mostly through our lawyers or short messages regarding the sale of the house. There was nothing left between us now except the logistics, and somehow, that helped. It created a kind of emotional distance that I needed. I didn't have to think about her as the person who had hurt me anymore. She was just part of the process now, something I had to deal with to move forward. It was strange how quickly the dynamic had shifted from a marriage to something more like a business transaction, but it also made the healing process a little easier. I spent more time focusing on myself, something I hadn't done in a long time. Being at Kevin's place had given me the space to think about what I wanted for my life now, without the constant reminders of Emily and the life we had shared. I started getting back into old hobbies I had let slip away over the years, things like reading, going for long runs, and catching up with friends I hadn't seen much of while I was married. It felt good to reconnect with parts of myself that had been neglected for so long. One day, Kevin and I were sitting in the living room, and he casually suggested that maybe it was time for me to find my own place. There was no pressure in his words, just a gentle nudge, but I knew he was right. As much as staying with him had been a safe space, it wasn't a long-term solution. I needed to start building my own life again, away from the shadows of what had happened. That afternoon, I started looking at apartments more seriously. I hadn't realized how much I needed something of my own until I saw the listings and imagined myself living in a new space, one that wasn't tied to Emily or our shared history. It was a strange feeling, but also a liberating one. I wasn't rushing into anything, but I could feel that familiar sense of control returning, like I was finally making decisions for my own future instead of reacting to the past. A few days later, I toured a couple of places. They weren't anything fancy, just small, practical apartments that felt comfortable. One in particular caught my eye. It wasn't far from Kevin's place, and it had a cozy, lived-in feel that made me think I could actually make it my own. As I walked through the rooms, I could picture what my life might look like there. Quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, evenings filled with books or movies, and most importantly, the chance to move forward in a space that was entirely mine. I ended up putting in an application, and by the end of the week, I had signed the lease. It felt like a huge step, not just in terms of having my own place, but in accepting that this was the beginning of a new chapter. I wasn't the same person I had been before everything with Emily happened, and that was okay. I was learning to navigate this new version of my life, one small decision at a time. Moving into the apartment was a bittersweet experience. Packing up the few belongings I had brought to Kevin's, I realized how much had changed in such a short amount of time. But as I carried the boxes into my new place, I also felt a strange sense of pride. I was starting over, and while it wasn't easy, it was something I could handle. Once everything was settled, I sat down in my new living room, the quiet surrounding me. There were no memories here, no echoes of the past. It was just me, alone with my thoughts, but for the first time in a while, that didn't feel like a bad thing. It felt like a clean slate, a chance to figure out who I wanted to be and what I wanted my life to look like moving forward. I knew I still had a long way to go. Healing wasn't something that happened overnight, and there would be plenty of days where the weight of everything would still feel heavy. But sitting there in my new apartment, I realized I was no longer just surviving the aftermath of the betrayal. I was starting to move forward, slowly, on my own terms. And for now, that was enough. Once I settled into the new apartment, life started to shift in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but little by little, I began to build a new routine. The small moments of daily life, cooking meals in my own kitchen, waking up in a space that was entirely mine, gave me a sense of normalcy I hadn't felt in a long time. It was strange how something as simple as choosing where to hang a picture or what to buy for the apartment could make me feel more grounded. The first few weeks in the new place felt like a quiet adjustment period. The apartment wasn't fully furnished yet, and the space echoed with emptiness, but that emptiness didn't bother me the way I thought it might. It was peaceful, almost. I spent a lot of time alone, figuring out what I wanted my days to look like now that they were no longer tied to the rhythms of my old life with Emily. I found myself enjoying the solitude. I had always thought of myself as someone who thrived on being around people, but this time alone was different. It gave me a chance to reflect, to think about where I had been and where I wanted to go. I didn't feel the need to rush into anything new or distract myself with constant activity. Instead, I took things one day at a time, slowly finding my footing. Kevin was still a big part of my life during this time. We'd grab dinner or catch a game on TV, but it was different now. I wasn't leaning on him as much as I had been before. He had become less of a crutch and more of a friend again, and that shift felt important. It was a sign that I was getting stronger, more capable of handling things on my own. I also started reconnecting with old friends, people I hadn't seen much of during my marriage. I had drifted away from them over the years, not intentionally, but because life had gotten busy. Now, with the space to breathe and no one to answer to, I found myself reaching out more. Some of them were surprised to hear from me, but most were happy to reconnect. It felt good to catch up, to rediscover parts of my life that had been left behind. Work became a welcome distraction too. I threw myself into projects, taking on more responsibility and using my free time to focus on career goals I had sidelined for years. My coworkers noticed the change in me, some asked if I was okay, sensing that something was different, but I didn't go into details. I wasn't ready to talk about everything with people who weren't close to me. Instead, I kept things professional, focusing on moving forward. One evening, after a particularly productive day at work, I found myself sitting on the couch in my new apartment, feeling a sense of calm that had been missing for so long. The apartment was starting to come together, little by little. The empty spaces were being filled, and with them, so was my sense of self. It wasn't just about putting furniture in the rooms, it was about creating a space that felt like mine, something I could call home. I wasn't naive enough to think that everything was fixed or that I was fully healed. There were still difficult days, moments when the past crept up and reminded me of the hurt, but those moments were fewer and farther between. The weight of the betrayal wasn't gone, but it no longer dominated every thought, every feeling. As the days passed, I realized I was starting to build something new, something that felt solid. It wasn't flashy or exciting, but it was mine. For the first time in a long time, I was living life on my own terms. The routine I was creating wasn't about distraction or avoidance, it was about slowly, steadily building the foundation of a life that was entirely my own. And in those quiet moments, as I sat in the apartment that was finally starting to feel like home, I began to understand that this was what moving forward looked like. It wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending the pain didn't happen. It was about creating a future that was stronger because of everything I had been through. As the weeks went by, I started to notice something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of inner strength. It wasn't a sudden realization, but rather a gradual understanding that I was capable of handling the challenges life threw at me. There were still difficult days, of course. Some nights, I'd lie awake, my mind wandering back to everything that had happened with Emily, but those moments no longer consumed me. They were part of my past, not my present. One of the turning points came when I decided to focus more on my health, both mental and physical. I had let myself get so wrapped up in the stress of the past few months that I'd neglected the things that kept me balanced. So, I made a conscious effort to change that. I started going to the gym again, something I hadn't done regularly since before the whole mess with Emily began. At first, it was tough to get back into the routine, but after a few sessions, I remembered why I had always enjoyed working out. It wasn't just about getting in shape, it was about feeling in control of my body and mind. Alongside the physical exercise, I started focusing more on my mental health. I'd never been the kind of person to dive into self-reflection or therapy, but after everything that had happened, I knew I needed to deal with some of the deeper emotions I'd been pushing aside. I started reading books about healing and growth, and though I wasn't sure where to start, the act of learning felt like progress. The more I read, the more I understood that healing wasn't a straight line, it was messy, with ups and downs. But the important thing was that I was taking the steps to heal, rather than staying stuck in the pain. I also began writing. It wasn't something I had ever done before, but one night, I felt the need to get my thoughts down on paper. I wasn't writing for anyone else, just for myself. I'd sit at the table in my new apartment, letting the words spill out. It was a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, but also a surprising sense of hope. Writing became a way for me to process everything I had been through, to make sense of the chaos in my mind. It felt like a release, like I was giving myself permission to let go of the weight I'd been carrying. As I started to piece my life back together, I noticed that the people around me, my friends, my coworkers, were starting to respond differently too. They could see the change in me, the way I was regaining my confidence and finding my way forward. Conversations no longer revolved around what had happened with Emily. Instead, they shifted to future plans, work projects, and the little things that made life feel normal again. It was a subtle shift, but it made all the difference. There was one afternoon, in particular, that stood out to me. I was sitting with Kevin, grabbing lunch at our usual spot, when he mentioned how proud he was of the way I had handled everything. It caught me off guard because, for the longest time, I hadn't felt proud of anything. But hearing it from someone who had seen me at my lowest, it made me realize just how far I'd come. Kevin wasn't the kind of guy to say things just to make someone feel better, so I knew he meant it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt proud of myself too. That conversation stuck with me. It wasn't about seeking validation from others, but it did remind me that I wasn't the same person I was when this all started. I had grown stronger, more resilient, even if it didn't always feel that way. The days continued to blend into weeks, but something had shifted. I was no longer looking back as often, no longer letting the past define how I felt about myself or my future. I had built something new, a life that, while still in progress, felt like it was truly mine. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. In those moments of quiet reflection, I realized that strength wasn't just about getting through the worst of it. It was about learning from it, growing from it, and knowing that no matter what came next, I had the ability to handle it. I wasn't afraid of the future anymore. I was ready for it. As time passed, I settled into a rhythm that felt right for me. Life wasn't perfect, but I was content. The routines I had built around work, the gym, and spending time with friends gave me a sense of stability. I no longer felt the constant weight of what had happened with Emily. My thoughts about her were now less frequent, more distant. It was like I had finally put that chapter of my life behind me, or at least I thought I had. One evening, as I was finishing up a run around the neighborhood, I decided to stop by a cafe I hadn't visited in a while. It was one of those spots Emily and I used to go to, but I hadn't stepped foot inside since we split. For some reason, it didn't feel as heavy as it once did, so I went in, grabbed a coffee, and sat by the window, enjoying the stillness of the evening. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but as I sat there, I saw Emily walk in. My heart skipped for a moment. I hadn't seen her in person since the final meeting at the cafe about the divorce. It was strange seeing her after all this time, like an echo from a life I used to live. She hadn't noticed me yet, so I debated whether I should just slip out quietly, but something in me decided against that. I stayed where I was, quietly observing as she ordered her drink. She looked the same, yet different. There was something about her that seemed more reserved, like the energy she used to carry had dimmed. When she finally noticed me, our eyes met for a second, and there was a brief moment of awkward recognition. She hesitated but then made her way over to my table, offering a small, tentative smile. We exchanged polite greetings, neither of us sure what to say. There was no anger between us, no tension, just a strange feeling of two people who once knew each other deeply but now felt like strangers. Emily mentioned how she had been, giving me a brief update on her life since the divorce. She had moved out of the house, like she'd planned, and was living in a new apartment across town. She said she was doing better, focusing on herself, much like I had been. As we spoke, I realized that I didn't feel the same hurt or bitterness I once did. Instead, there was an odd sense of closure in the conversation. When the topic shifted to us, she expressed regret, not in a dramatic way, but quietly, almost like she had been carrying it for a while. She said she wished things had gone differently, that she had handled everything better. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness, but more of an acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. Hearing it didn't stir up the emotions I thought it might. Instead, I found myself feeling a strange sense of peace. I told her that while what had happened had been painful, it had also taught me a lot. I had grown from it, and in a way, I was grateful for that growth. I didn't say it to make her feel better, but because it was the truth. The person I had become in the aftermath of our marriage was stronger, more resilient, and I could see that now. Our conversation was brief, but it felt like a necessary closing chapter. When she eventually stood up to leave, we exchanged a quick goodbye, and she walked out of the cafe, disappearing into the evening. As I sat there, watching her go, I realized that I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I wasn't anything, really. It was just another moment, part of a life that had changed. Seeing her hadn't stirred up the flood of emotions I thought it might. Instead, it made me feel like I had truly moved on. There was no longer a hold on me, no lingering resentment or what-ifs. Emily was a part of my past, but she no longer had a place in my present or my future. As I finished my coffee and left the cafe, the weight that had once felt so overwhelming was finally gone. I walked out into the night, feeling lighter, like I had finally let go of everything that had been keeping me tied to the past. This was closure, not the kind that comes with dramatic confrontations or emotional goodbyes, but the quiet, internal kind. The kind that comes when you realize you've finally made peace with everything that happened, and you're ready to keep moving forward, free from the shadows of what once was. After that unexpected meeting with Emily, something shifted inside me. It was subtle but noticeable. I hadn't realized just how much I had been waiting for closure until it came in that quiet cafe. The encounter wasn't filled with dramatic emotions or unfinished business, it was just a moment that finally allowed me to close the door on that chapter of my life. And with it closed, I found myself looking forward with more clarity and hope than I had in a long time. In the days that followed, I felt lighter. The weight of the past, the betrayal, the hurt, the endless questioning, had finally lifted. It wasn't that I had forgotten what had happened, but more that it no longer had the power over me that it once did. I wasn't defined by it anymore. The anger and pain that had followed me for so long had been replaced by something else, acceptance. I started thinking more seriously about the future. Not just in vague terms, but real, tangible plans. I realized that I hadn't truly allowed myself to dream about what came next, because I had been so stuck in what had happened. But now, with the past firmly behind me, the future seemed wide open. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, I made a list of things I wanted to do, things I had put off for years. It wasn't a grand list of life goals, but small, meaningful things that had once brought me joy. Travel was at the top of the list. I had always talked about taking a solo trip, something for myself, but I had never followed through. Now, with the freedom to make my own choices, I decided it was time. I booked a trip to the mountains, somewhere quiet and away from the noise of everyday life. It wasn't about running away from anything, but rather embracing the idea of doing something purely for myself. As the trip approached, I found myself feeling excited in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Excited for the possibilities, for the new experiences, for the chance to reflect without the weight of the past hanging over me. The trip itself was everything I had hoped it would be. The fresh air, the long hikes, the peaceful solitude, it gave me time to think, but also time to simply be. I wasn't constantly replaying old memories or questioning the choices I had made. Instead, I was focused on the present, on the beauty around me, and on the fact that I had finally reached a place of peace within myself. During one of those long hikes, as I stood at the top of a trail overlooking a valley, I felt a sense of accomplishment. Not because I had conquered a mountain or done something extraordinary, but because I had made it through the hardest period of my life and come out on the other side stronger. It wasn't just about surviving what had happened with Emily, it was about the growth that came from it. I realized that the life I was building now, piece by piece, was entirely mine. It wasn't shaped by anyone else's expectations or by the pain of the past. It was shaped by the choices I was making for myself, by the strength I had found in moving forward. And that, more than anything, was what I had needed all along. When I returned from the trip, I felt renewed, ready to dive into whatever came next. I continued focusing on work, reconnecting with friends, and building a life that felt authentic to who I had become. The old wounds no longer dictated my choices, and the sense of freedom that came with that was more powerful than I had expected. Looking back, I saw how far I had come, from the moment I found out about Emily's betrayal to the long, slow process of healing. It hadn't been easy, but I had learned so much along the way. I had learned that strength wasn't about pretending everything was fine, it was about allowing myself to feel the pain, to go through it, and to come out stronger on the other side. Now, I wasn't afraid of what the future held. I knew that whatever came next, I had the tools to handle it. Life would continue to have its ups and downs, but I had learned how to navigate those moments with resilience and self-compassion. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. Fully, freely, and without the weight of the past holding me back. This was my new beginning.